What is often very important is that those medical boards typically contain at least one contemporaneous medical evaluation of some sort. Some are pretty sketchy, but there's something there. And so if you're talking about someone who's making a claim for mental health in particular, there's usually at least a referral for a psychiatric evaluation. Sometimes there will be an actual report or at least an indication that, Jones was acting strangely and we sent him off to see the shrink, kind of stuff. But so that file, and then what we learned, wasn't immediately obvious, but we learned is that separately there are hospital records, that the hospital records are not contained in the service medical records, which never made any sense to me, but that's the way it works.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA. If you're a veteran struggling with the VA's disability system or just want to make sure you're getting the benefits you've earned, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe so you can never miss an update that may change your life. I'm Christian Terrison, here with renowned Veterans Disability Attorney Francis Jackson of Jackson and MacNichol. Jack has dedicated his career to helping veterans like you win the benefits you deserve, recovering millions of dollars for thousands of heroes. This podcast isn't just for veterans navigating the system, though. It's for their families, their friends, and anyone else who wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who served. So stick around, because we're here to make sure you get the support you need. Now, today's show is on a frustratingly common and also frustratingly difficult problem, and that is record inaccuracies writ large. So whether it's in the personnel file, the medical records, etc. I've seen cases where the DD-214 has the wrong dates, Article 15s that never happened, all kinds of things. So when a veteran is faced with record inaccuracies, where can they start?
Well, there are a couple of kinds of inaccuracies in the records. One is that records are missing. The others are, as you alluded to, the records are just wrong. Generally speaking, as soon as you discover an inaccuracy in the record, if you're pursuing VA benefits, which is obviously the topic we're talking about, you want to contact the VA and say, this error in the records, it says X and it should say Y. Now, some of those are relatively easy for them to straighten out. If the DD-214, for example, has the wrong dates, they can usually get subsidiary information from the military that will show the correct dates of service. Others are harder, but the bulk of the problems really turn out not to be critical. Most of the inaccuracies in the records are not ones that are going to directly affect the outcome of a claim for compensation or pension. Unfortunately, there are some where that's not the case, but they're all frustrating. For example, we had a case, in fact, we're still finishing it up, case where a gentleman explained that while he was in the military, he had a severe mental breakdown and was hospitalized at the VA hospital, or at the military hospital at Valley Forge, which no longer exists. But the VA kept saying that didn't show anywhere in his records. And we went around and around with the folks at the Record Center in St. Louis. And ultimately, what we were able to do was to get what are called the morning reports, which are the reports that units do daily showing who's present and who's otherwise accounted for if they're not present and why and so on. And we were able to show that at the period that he said he was in the hospital, he did not show up as present at his unit. And finally, we found one entry where another soldier was detailed to go with him to the hospital. Now that did not show in his records, but in the morning report, it showed up that Smith was assigned to go with Jones to the hospital. But the crazy part of it was, turns out St. Louis had the records, but they have a rule that mental health records, which could have a deleterious effect on someone reading about their mental health problems, will not be released except to a physician. But what they don't tell you is that they won't tell you that there are records that they're not releasing. So it just got truly crazy. We went years and years around with that case before we finally found the records that showed that, yes, he was hospitalized. But going back to the inaccuracies issue, most of the time what you're dealing with are missing records, and the VA is saying, well, there's no evidence of that. And so you can substitute for the missing records statements from people who were there, statements from people who know, tangentially about the issue, and resolve it that way. But the thing you need to understand, the VA has forms for almost everything, and these days you have to make a claim using a specific form, but they don't have a form for this. There is no form in the entire VA litany of multiple forms, literally hundreds of forms, for missing records. There is no form for that. There is, within each branch of the military, an organization for the correction of military records. In most branches, it's called the Board for Correction of, whether it's Army records or whoever. But that is one way you can approach these things. But that's for big deal things. You don't want to go through that whole time-consuming, expensive process for a relatively minor misstatement in the records. But if it's something that's really, really a big deal, that may ultimately be your only option to get it corrected.
And earlier you had mentioned that most record inaccuracies are fairly inconsequential, but I wanted to mention one case where there was clearly a typographical error on a DD-214, but what had happened is the rest of the personnel record substantiated the period of service quite thoroughly.
Yep.
But what had happened is the regional office, whoever was the reviewer that day, looked at the claim, looked at the DD-214, saw that the claimed events happened outside the period of service per the DD-214, and that was enough for them to rubber stamp the denial.
Yep.
And that's how the case landed on my desk, where, if whoever was reviewing it at the regional office had simply turned a few more pages in the personnel record, would have seen that, a couple of numbers got flipped in the year on the DD-214. But, they're understaffed, overworked, and, sadly we see a lot of that type of problem.
Yeah, one of the very frustrating things about the way VA measures the productivity of their employees is that they do it in an odd way that discourages people from actually sitting down and digging into the file and really understanding it. This point system where you get credit for looking at the file and deciding that there's something that needs to be fixed and sending it off to be fixed, rather than sitting down and just reading through the file and learning it so that you understand the whole thing. It's an unusual system, to put it mildly. And it really seems to discourage people from really reviewing the claims in depth. Another problem that has arisen is they have what they call the national work queue. And so it used to be that if you went to a particular regional office, say you went to the Togus regional office in Maine, or you went to the Baltimore regional office in Maryland, that the person who was going to work on your claim would be in that office and would, typically be, if not necessarily the same person every time, at least part of the same team where they would be kind of bumping elbows and they'd share information fairly easily. But with this national work queue, you can have 3 claims that can be being worked on in, Montana and Mississippi and Nevada all at the same time. And nobody's talking to each other because they're all in separate work queues. Mm-hmm. And it really, it's unfortunate. And I understand why the VA had to go to the national work queue, because there was such disparity from office to office about the volume of claims and the where they had experienced people, but it has not helped.
So earlier you had mentioned that it can be time-consuming and exacting and expensive process to get some types of errors corrected. I guess when trying to figure out if it's worth fighting to correct a record versus working around an inaccurate record, what is the strategic calculus there? What are some things that veterans can look at?
Sure. Generally speaking, I would tell people not to go to the Board of Corrections unless they need to change the nature of a discharge. Say they have what is commonly called a bad paper discharge, which is a bar to benefits. Obviously, no benefits unless you get that changed, so you really don't have a choice. You've got to get that corrected. And I had one interesting case a few years ago where the gentleman was focused on getting his discharge corrected to be a medical discharge. And what it was, this was a fellow who had served in Vietnam, in fact won the Silver Star, which is no small thing, but came back to the States and just had terrible PTSD. But this was before 1980, so it was before PTSD was a thing, before it was a diagnosis. And he unfortunately was a black gentleman and dealing with an office in the South. And I can't swear that there was racial animus, but it sure looked that way from the file. Anyway, regardless of the reasons, the reviewers in the regional office would say things like, well, the doctor says this is, battle fatigue, and he's got a psychiatric condition, but we don't believe it. And, it's just crazy stuff. We did eventually get him 100% benefits and all the way back and everything else, but it was just very strange. And one of the things he did along the way is he went to the Board of Corrections for medical records and actually got them to correct his discharge to a medical discharge and made him eligible for some retirement benefits. But of course, because of the offset, it didn't really give him any more money, but he felt very strongly about it and was successful in getting it corrected.
One thing that you touched on earlier that I think sheds a lot of light on why this is so complicated a topic is who controls what sets of records. So, you have service treatment records, you have personnel records, you have the C file. Can you talk a little bit about the entities that control these and then what the impact is for veterans?
Yep. So everybody who serves in the military has a regular file, and when that gets turned over to the VA, they refer to it as the claims file or C file. Separately from that, there is a personnel file, and the personnel file has some of the same information, but it may have some very significant other information as well. Typically, it will have any discipline administered, it will have records of training, it will have a variety of different things. There may be evaluations in there, there may be a medical discharge report in the file. Whenever we see someone whose period of service doesn't seem to match their period of enlistment, there's always a suspicion that they were medically discharged. And what usually happens is that the services always, this is just so common, it becomes ludicrous, but they will always say that this person is being discharged because of this medical condition that existed prior to service. EPTS. I don't think I've ever seen one where they concluded, oh, he really got hurt here in the service, and we should be responsible for that. It's always, oh, it existed prior to service. But anyway, what is often very important is that those medical boards typically contain at least one contemporaneous medical evaluation of some sort. Some are pretty sketchy, but there's something there. And so if you're talking about someone who's making a claim for mental health in particular, there's usually at least a referral for a psychiatric evaluation. Sometimes there will be an actual report or at least an indication that, Jones was acting strangely and we sent him off to see the shrink, kind of stuff. But so that file, and then what we learned, wasn't immediately obvious, but we learned is that separately there are hospital records, that the hospital records are not contained in the service medical records, which never made any sense to me, but that's the way it works. So if you know that the person was treated at a hospital while in the service, you have to ask separately for them to search for the hospital records, and they may or may not find them. A large number of the military hospitals have been closed, and the records have been archived, but not very carefully. There is a story from a fellow I have met who is a paralegal. Now technically they call them accredited agents, but he works on VA claims for a veteran service organization and is now accredited. But anyway, he went to find his medical hospital records from the service. And so he traced them to a storage facility. And I've forgotten. I think off the top of my head, this storage facility was in Buffalo, New York, but don't hold me to that. It doesn't matter the location. So he got there and said, okay, I need these hospital records. Here is the archiving information. And the person in charge of the storage facility said, well, they're not really stored like that, but it's probably in those boxes over in that corner. And he literally searched hundreds of boxes before they found the records. They did find them, they were there, but they're not stored in a coherent, retrievable way in many cases. And so getting hospital records from the military has proven to be challenging at best in a lot of situations. But they will not be in the service medical records. That's the important thing to know. And so then you have to figure out, okay, if they're not in the service medical records, where are they, and are they retrievable? And maybe we can figure out where they are, and maybe they're retrievable. It's a crapshoot, frankly.
I remember one case I worked on, it was the claimed condition was hepatitis, and it hinged on a particular vaccination being administered at a particular time, at a particular site. And this poor veteran had been told, nope, they're gone, they don't have them, etc., etc. Long story short, he ended up calling a friend who lived nearby, who went in person, and by going in person and saying, I'll sit and wait while you look, lo and behold, they were able to find them in a dusty corner out back, and that case was successful. But yeah, it really...
Yeah, it's a crapshoot getting those old records. I mean, I had one case where we represented this gentleman, and he said, while I was in basic training at Fort Dix, after I finished my basic training, I was assigned to the casual labor pool while they tried to figure out where I was going to go. And they had us tearing down some old buildings. And a piece of the building fell on my back. That's how I hurt my back, and it's gotten worse and worse. So lo and behold, we, sent off to St. Louis for the personnel file, and we told them what we needed. And they came back and said, no, we don't have any record of that. And this went up to the court, came back down, and did that a couple times. And we asked a couple more times, can you search for records? Nope, nothing. Finally, on I think the fourth remand, the veteran's wife went to the local senator's office and said, gee, can you help us get these records? And they made a request. And lo and behold, magically, this record appears from wherever they tucked it away that showed that, in fact, he'd been hurt when part of the building fell on him and hurt his back. The getting these records sometimes is just ridiculously challenging. But the two words I always use about what you need for a VA claim are these two: patience and persistence. Patience and persistence will let you win most of these cases, ultimately.
We're almost out of time for today, but I did have one last thing I wanted to ask about.
Sure.
There are a number of veterans I've spoken with who sort of have this assumption that the VA will fix the errors. They just need to, tell them about it. And they'll reference sometimes the duty to assist. Oh, well, this is wrong. I told them it's wrong. They're going to fix it. Is there anything to that?
Well, the VA does have a duty to assist. And unfortunately, there's legislation that came into effect in February of 2019, the AMA, that limits the duty to assist. But there is still a duty to assist. And sometimes, if you point out to the VA what's missing and ask them nicely, they will find the missing records. Sometimes they will just say, well, sorry, there aren't any records. And as I said earlier, it's a crapshoot. There was a time before COVID when outside researchers were allowed to go into the Records Center in St. Louis. And in every, 20th case maybe, we would hire a researcher to go in and look because there was a record that they said they couldn't find. And sometimes people could find it, sometimes they couldn't. But we knew that they had at least gone and looked. And, with some degree of success, because these were folks who'd been doing this a while and they understood how the records were organized and they knew what to look for. And if they couldn't find that exact record, sometimes they could find records that would show that this was necessarily correct. So they shut that down, and I don't know whether they allow outside researchers in there now or not. I haven't had occasion to see since they reopened the Record Center after COVID. But, it's the duty to assist is important and requires the VA to at least make an effort to search for records, and it should be utilized whenever it's appropriate, but it isn't necessarily the end-all and be-all.
Yes. All right. On that note, this has been another episode of Victory Over VA. Thank you for tuning in. Please be sure to like and subscribe, and we hope to see you again next week.
We'll look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.